So let me just confirm. Desiree, is the recording on? Oh, okay. It looks like it just started. Welcome, everyone. I now call to order this work session of the Anchorage Assembly. It is Friday, November 19, 2021. We are noticed from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m., and this is a work session on budget amendments. Ms. Camacho, would you call the roll, please?
Yes. Ms. Allard?
Here.
Constance? Mr. Dunbar? Mr. Dunbar? I see him on the list, but we'll come back to him. Ms. Kennedy?
Here.
France?
Here.
Mr. Perez-Verdilla?
Here.
Mr. Peterson?
Present.
Ms. Quinn Davidson?
Here.
Nope. Mr. Weddleton?
Here.
And Ms. Zalatal?
Here.
Quorum.
And I'm present if you said my name. Thanks.
Okay.
And that was Mr. Rivera. And thank you. Mr. Dunbar? We see you on there. Okay. We can confirm later, but it appears Mr. Dunbar is here.
Oh, sorry. Yes, I'm here. I'm having some tech issues.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started because we have 26 amendments to go through. And hopefully everyone received the packet of amendments from Ms. Camacho. And the plan is that we are going to start with the capital amendments, followed by the utilities, enterprise activities amendments, then general government amendments that don't pertain to the alcohol tax, and then general government amendments that do pertain to the alcohol tax. So we will go through each one with the sponsors or sponsor providing a summary. And if members have questions, I do ask that they be brief, given that we have so many amendments. And also, please remember that this is not the time for debate. We will not be getting into the merits of each amendment. This is, as a work session, informational only. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. The first amendment to the proposed 2022 capital improvement budget for AO 2021-97, Constant and Peterson number 1. Mr. Constant or Mr. Peterson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. This was something that was it's been planned for a couple of years. I spoke with the Parks Department about this. I believe they're planning to do some improvement work on dugouts on Little League fields and baseball fields around the city. And this is the estimate they came up with. Obviously, they won't be able to repair or update them all, but there'll be, several that will be able to be completed for the $250,000. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. I don't see anyone in the queue with questions, and so we'll just continue to go through, and if members have questions, I'll pause before we go on to the next group of amendments so we can come back to any of these. So the second amendment in the packet is Constant number 1. Actually, Mr. Weddleton's in the queue. Go ahead, Mr. Weddleton.
Yeah, just backing up to the first one there. So this says it's $250,000, and then looking down at the chart, is that $250,000 for each of the next 4 years?
Well, Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. This 250,000 is for this year, and to do all the improvements that they're planning over the next several years. This is what the estimates are. And we're obviously just going to be voting on this amendment for this year.
Okay, just checking. Thank you.
Mr. Dunbar, did you want to add anything?
Yes, just because, on the Park Foundation board, we got to hear a little bit more from Parks and Rec. And I believe that what you're seeing there with 250, 250, 250, that was what was planned in the 5-year plan or 6-year plan we passed last year. This also relates to some of the amendments that I have in the future. So I think, and Desiree can correct me, when we see this kind of like chart here, it reflects kind of what our long-term plan was that we passed last year.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Seeing no other members in the queue, we will go ahead and move on to the next amendment. Constant Amendment number 1. And is Mr. Constant on? I know he is joining remotely. Okay, I don't see him. This is to Parks and Recreation, Government Hill Community-Wide Park Plan and Improvements. The amount is $300,000. This amendment returns funding for fiscal year 22 to the Government Hill Community-Wide Park Plan and Improvements Project and moves correlating O&M to fiscal year 22. We can come back to this one if when Mr. Constant is on later. So we'll go ahead and move on to the next amendment, which is Constant and Dunbar number 1. Mr. Dunbar?
Sure. So related to what I just said about the long-term plan. So, over the last several years, we've been passing these plans that anticipate money being spent in 2021, 2022, 2023. And some of those projects were taken out by the administration, the one that we had planned in 2022. We heard from the Parks Department kind of what were the 5 projects that would have been sort of next in line that got removed. And this was one of them, this Eastchester Park upgrade, and then 2 of the ones we'll be talking about, I guess the next 2 or 3 amendments. Actually, I think the 5 were the ones we've just seen. It was athletic field improvements, it was Government Hill, Eastchester, and then 2 projects in East Anchorage.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. I don't see any members in the queue with questions. So we will go ahead and move on to the next amendment. Constant, Dunbar, and Peterson number 1. Mr. Dunbar or Mr. Peterson?
Pete, would you want to speak to this or do you want me to?
Go ahead.
Okay, thanks. So this is one you guys have seen resolutions from the Northeast Community Council, from St. Phillis Community Council, from Russian Jack Community Council for these next 2. Again, these were funds that were planned for 2022 that weren't on the proposed capital budget. And I should say also, I mean, obviously we get sort of 2 bites at the apple here. You can put it in the capital budget now, or you can amend it in January. And if a project doesn't make it onto the capital budget this time, that doesn't prevent us at all from amending the ordinances that put things on the capital, on the actual bond that go before the voter. That's the vote we take in January. But I just felt, to sort of let folks know that what I intend to do, that we would amend the capital budget too. And so this is money that was planned before. This will actually go to help, along with some federal funds, build some bridges, some literal bridges that cross the Chester Creek as it meanders its way through Chauncenue Muldoon Park.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Do members have any questions on this amendment? Seeing no one in the queue, we'll go ahead and move on to the next one. Constant, Dunbar,
so
and Peterson number 2. Go ahead, Mr.
Madam
Dunbar.
Chair, I'll just speak really briefly. This is #1 priority for Russian Jack Community Council, but it's also supported by a number of other community councils. It's a big regional park, as you know, and we've been in this master plan process now for about a year, and there's been money going towards the planning, and then also money to these, particularly the safety and ADA improvements. We had a good presentation from Mr. Refuse at the Northeast Community Council last night. They have some big plans for this park involving federal funds as well. And this helps sort of keep it moving forward. And eventually hopefully we'll be able to build a new tunnel underneath Dunbar to connect the sort of north and south part of Russian Jack Park. But there are a variety of other lighting and ADA safety upgrades that need to be made to the park. And so this was money that was expected to be on the bond when we passed the long-term plans last year.
And Madam Chair, if I might, this is actually, they first started talking about this in 2017. So the community has been putting input into this plan for well over 3 years at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson, and thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Just pausing for any questions. Seeing no one in the queue, we'll go ahead and move on to the next capital amendment, which is Dunbar and Peterson #1.
So this will be the last one I speak to for a little bit. I'm sure you're already tired of hearing from me, but in the long-term plan that we passed for the previous road bonds, there was actually $550,000 just for Northeast, for the Northeast Community Council area, because the traffic calming needs are so intense in a lot of East Anchorage because it's so dense and some of the roads are so old. We really need a lot of traffic calming work. Mr. Peterson and I had a really good conversation with Mr. Coy, the new traffic engineer. I think everybody here knows that our traffic calming sort of expert left the municipality under kind of tragic circumstances, and I think they are still trying to hire for that position. So we are a little bit backed up on some projects, but in speaking with Mr. Coy and certainly with the community council, I believe there's still a lot of demand and and this will increase the amount of funding going to O&M for management of these projects as well. And the last thing I'll say is, although in the long-term plan it was $550,000 just for Northeast, this is municipal-wide to go from $500,000 to $1 million, because I also recognize there are lots of traffic calming projects in other parts of the city too. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. I've got a couple members in the queue. First, Mr. Weddleton, and then Mr. Rivera.
Thanks. So, on this one with the traffic calming, what we saw recently was that there's over $1 million in already approved bond capacity for traffic calming. And I just wonder, and it's a basic question, if there's administration folks there, do we need to have this in there if we've already got a huge amount, possibly more than we have the capacity to get done next year anyway?
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Is there someone from the administration who can address that question?
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is Amy DeBosky. The information that we got from the department was it was a sufficient amount of money we already have built into the budget for traffic calming. The administration does not expect or believe that we need this at this time.
Thank you, Ms. Demosky. Any follow-up, Mr. Weddleton?
No, thanks. And not that I'm a huge fan of traffic calming, so I don't want to come across that way. But I think it's unfortunate there's so much money sitting there and not used yet. But if that's a reality, something to note for this. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Mr. Rivera.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So 2 things. One is I appreciate that the clarity that this is going to be a citywide or Anchorage Bowl-wide amount of funds, because there are traffic calming needs, a lot of traffic calming needs in Midtown as well. I have a question though for you, Madam Chair, on a process question. So I'm wondering what the process is for members who want to add their name as sponsors for amendments. Now, there are two members who are a sponsor on this one. So me adding my name would be 3, which is totally fine. But did you have any clarity on if there are some amendments that are 3 members and a 4th or a 5th, or an X number of members wanted to add on as sponsors? Would that be okay for us to do at this meeting?
Thank you, Mr. Rivera, and I would want to confirm with Mr. Gates, but I think if members would like to express a desire to join as a sponsor at this meeting, since it's public, that would be fine. And then we would work with Ms. Camacho and Mr. Gates to ensure we're doing that correctly. Does that answer your question, Mr. Rivera, or address it?
Sure. I guess that answers my question for now. And then, if anyone wants to chime in later on whether we can do that now or not, that would be awesome. But I guess for now, seeing as there are huge needs for traffic calming in Midtown, I would like to add myself as a sponsor to this amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rivera. Next, we'll go to Ms. Zelatel, and then Ms. Quinn Davidson, and then Mr. Perez Verdilla. Ms. Zelatel?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Given, I guess pending clarification, I'd like to go ahead and ask that I be added as a sponsor to all of the amendments we've seen so far, and then I will let you know moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Zelatel. Ms. Quinn Davidson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I agree with what my colleague said about the importance of traffic calming throughout our city. I'd like to have my name added. And I'd also just like to point out that if internal staff aren't able to do this work, there's nothing that prevents us from contracting it out, putting it out to bid, and getting this work done for our community. So I'll be supporting this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Quinn Davidson. Mr. Perez Verdilla?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just want to voice my support for this as well. Would like to add my name to this amendment, and also have a suggestion in terms of process. And I can tell you that there are a number of amendments coming that I would like to add my name to. If it was possible for there to be an easy way for you to inquire about that as we're moving through these, so that each person doesn't necessarily have to put their name in a queue or ask a question. I'm just curious if there's a process that you can do that.
Thank you, Mr. Perez Verdilla. I was thinking I would address it on the back end while folks were speaking. And actually, Ms. Camacho, not to put you on the spot, which I'm about to do, but would it work if members contact you directly regarding their desire to join as a sponsor?
That is perfectly fine with me, and also I'm taking notes, so if anybody verbalizes it during the meeting, I'll go ahead and add you, and I've got everybody so far. Whatever's easiest for the members.
Great, thank you, Ms. Camacho. And Ms. Quinn Davidson made a suggestion about members typing in at the end whether they want their name added to which amendments, and I would need to read those aloud so they're on the record. And then Mr. Rivera, you're in the queue.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Just on the same issue, I just want to make sure that we aren't running afoul of the Open Meetings Act. So it would just be great to have some clarity. For my part, the more that we can do it on the public record, I think the better, rather than doing it offline. But if staff could help discern which is the best route, that would be great. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Rivera. Mr. Gates, are you on right now?
Hi, yes, I'm here.
Would you be?
Sorry, could you repeat the question there for me?
What do you suggest as the best way for members to add their names as sponsors to the amendments as we discuss them today to comply with the Open Meetings Act?
you know, if you're here today in work session that, you know, is in compliance, I guess, mostly you're sharing information on your plans for the budget. I think if somebody wants to add their names as sponsor, you could do that today during this work session. Otherwise, you are able to inform myself or Ms. Clerk, you know, an individual member that says I want to be added to so-and-so's amendment on this. You could simply by an email from the one member to Ms. Camacho or the clerk or myself and ask to be added. And then we will make that happen in the documentation for Tuesday night. And I guess Ms. Camacho, maybe from her too, she actually might be the best point of contact for these things, for these communications. And if she might want to add, you know.
Thank you, Mr. Gates. So I think if members want to speak up at the meeting on the record here, if you want to join as a sponsor, or if you want to contact Ms. Camacho or Mr. Gates, or as he said, a member of the clerk's office, though it may run most smoothly through Ms. Camacho as she has been preparing the amendments, you can do that as well. Mr. Rivera. Oh, okay. Was that Mr. Perez-Verdilla?
Yeah, I put it in the chat, but I just was hoping Mr. Gates would speak specifically to this idea of having more than 3 members as sponsors on an amendment, and whether there was anything we needed to do to specifically address that.
Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates, would you like to respond?
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, you know, if, you know, the 3 or more members aren't discussing the amendments outside of a meeting and you're still able to have your names on them, you know, that rule, as long as you do it the way that we're suggesting and talking about here, you know, the reason that we don't have 3 names on amendments or on an ordinance or so forth when sponsored is prophylactic to dissuade any perception that more than 3 members are discussing outside of a meeting the particular item. So that's the reason for it. I guess, you know, if we have this on record here where our process is inform Ms. Camacho, don't talk to the other sponsors of an amendment you want to be added to for Tuesday night. Just direct Ms. Camacho to add your name. And we've got that on record and we see this Tuesday night. I think that we're okay in terms of Open Meetings Act. Just don't go discussing the amendment with more than 3 of you, you know, in emails or outside of a meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Gates. Mr. Perez-Verdilla, anything else?
Nope. Thank you for letting me ask the question.
Of course. And then I just want to circle back to Mr. Rivera. Did you get your questions answered, Mr. Rivera?
I did. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay. And so again, if members want to join as sponsors, you can speak up today, or you can contact Ms. Camacho or Mr. Gates. And as always, if there are more than 3 people involved, then conversations need to be in a publicly noticed setting, such as this work session or our meeting on Tuesday. Okay, I think at this point we can move on to the next one. I'll just note that for the Dunbar and Peterson amendment concerning traffic calming, we asked, or there are 4 members who asked to join as sponsors: Mr. Rivera, Ms. Zelatel, Ms. Quinn Davidson, and Mr. Perez-Verdilla. Okay, the next amendment is LaFrance and Weddleton number 1 concerning Academy Vanguard Drive. Mr. Weddleton?
Oh, thanks. This is something that most of us have seen before, I think, with the issue with this project with the state putting a tunnel under Seward Highway to connect kind of the Diamond Center side with the neighborhood side. And this is the Academy Vanguard project is the one that would link Academy to Abbott to take care of the additional 9,000 to 10,000 cars per day. But it's not, this doesn't show up on the CIP list that we were given. I just put this together just to get that on that CIP list. So it's on the MTP, it's in the tip. So from the AMAT side, it's all lined up. It's just missing on our list.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. There are two members in the queue. First, Ms. Zelatel.
Thank you. A question and then perhaps a comment. The question is, I thought that the prior right-of-way acquisition was going to be used as the match for the local contribution to this project. Is that not true? And instead we need to bond for this $200,000?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I don't know. I know that we had 2 million in the tip for this, and I wasn't sure how much was already done for the match. So I penciled that in, but I'm hoping as we go through these today. So this is obviously not fully cooked, I guess, but for the administration to look into that and see if we have enough. I just wanted to highlight that that's a possibility. So hopefully not. Hopefully we do not have to bond more for it.
Okay, I appreciate that. If this amendment is needed to keep this project on pace and moving, I'd like to be added as a co-sponsor, as this project is extremely important to the Abbott Loop Community Council, which we, myself, Mr. Weddleton, Ms. LaFrance, and Mr. Rivera all represent. Thanks.
Can I speak on another connected item, Suzanne?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so this, I don't have it ready yet, but I hope to have something by Tuesday or sooner. And this is part of Vanguard. This is Vanguard north of Academy to connect with Abbott Loop, but Vanguard south of Academy to connect with Independence also has a significant, presumably, the study says a 30% increase in traffic. No sidewalk. It's about half of the length is by apartment buildings. And there was a study done 3 years ago that said it would cost about $700,000 to just put in a sidewalk. So I anticipate having an additional project to add to our project list that would include that, just to keep that alive and in play. I just didn't get that done yet, but it would be probably $1 million and paid for through a bond.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Ms. Zelatel, did you have any follow-up?
No, thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Zelatel. Mr. Dunbar?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Zalatel covered what I was going to say, but I would also like to be added as a co-sponsor if this is needed, just because, for better or worse, I've been part of the group that has been very involved in Academy Vanguard over the last several years, and so I want to make sure that we're doing right by the neighborhood. So.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar, and Mr. Rivera has asked to be added as a sponsor. So right now, to LaFrance and Littleton, number one, I'm adding Ms. Zelatel if should this amendment be needed, and also Mr. Dunbar and Mr. Rivera. Is there anyone else? Okay, seeing no other members in the queue, we will go ahead and move on to Constant and Dunbar number one, which is Solid Waste Services Administration. And I know Mr. Constant is having some technical difficulties and trying to get on. So Mr. Dunbar, if you want to speak to this one.
Oh, sorry. Sure. There is a senior code enforcement official at SWS that does, I believe, some crucial work that is not duplicated by anyone else in the municipality. We know that our code enforcement officers are already overworked within the municipality itself. I've spoken with Mr. Zappe, and he and I share a disagreement on this, but I'm hoping he'll come around at some point. I know they've talked about having the drivers themselves sort of do the reporting when you have overflowing trash bins, for example, or dumpsters, and this person makes them do an increase in service so that we don't have that problem. And so this is all within the SWS budget. It makes a small cut within collections and another small within disposal, and it restores that FTE. And I believe that's the all-in cost, working with Desiree. That's the all-in cost, including benefits and everything. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. I don't see any members in the queue. Are there any members who wish to be added as a sponsor? Okay, we'll go ahead then and move on. And I'm sorry, I meant to note that we had actually stopped with the capital improvement amendments. And obviously we're dealing with the utilities enterprise activities amendments, and that was the first one. So we will move on then to the next one.
Madam Chair, this is Mr. Constant. I'm present.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Actually, before we continue to move on, Mr. Constant, did you want to speak to your capital amendment, constant number 1, concerning the Government Hill community-wide park plan and improvements? This, for members in your packet, this is the second one.
Yes, I'll be happy to. I broadly worked hard to create amendments to add back into the bond all of the program projects that were in the CIP and listed as projects for this year. And so a few of them were just my district. Most of them were everyone else's district, but this one is my district, and it's very important to my neighbors. They've been in the process for several years to get here, and the purpose of this is just to continue the process of getting that master plan in place for the neighborhood. And I'm asking for your help.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. So Ms. Zalatel had asked to be added as a sponsor to this amendment, as has Ms. Quinn Davidson, who actually has asked to be added as a sponsor to all the capital amendments that we've talked about. Are there any other members who would like to be added to this amendment, constant number 1?
Please add me, Chair.
Was that Mr. Dunbar?
Yes.
Okay, I have added Mr. Dunbar. Okay, seeing no one else in the queue, we will go ahead and continue with the enterprise utilities amendments. With Zalatel number 1, solid waste services disposal. Ms. Zalatel?
Thank you, Madam Chair. This restores the funding for the solid waste services composting program. The intention here is to keep the funding and then revisit this in first quarter budget revisions after we have the report, which is due by the end of the month, I believe, on the composting program, so that we could be more informed before making any decisions on whether or not to shelve this program for a year. Also, there really aren't any anticipated costs between now and first quarter budget revisions. So while this money will remain in the budget, it won't necessarily be spent in that January to April timeframe. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Zalatel. Are there any questions or any members who would like to join as a sponsor to this amendment?
Sure, Mr. Constant, please.
Okay, so adding Mr. Constant as a sponsor. Adding Mr. Rivera for the chat and Ms. Quinn Davidson as well as sponsors. I also do want to note, and adding Mr. Perez Verdia and Mr. Dunbar. I think I have everybody. Mr. Constant, Mr. Rivera, Ms. Quinn Davidson, Mr. Presverdia, and Mr. Dunbar being added as sponsors to Zelatel number 1. And I just want to note for members that page numbers on the amendments, there was a little conversation in the chat about numbering of amendments. Page numbers for the amendments are at the bottom, so I'll reference the page number as we go through this as well. Seeing no one else in the queue, we will go ahead and move on to the next Utilities Enterprise Activities Amendment, which is Presverdia, Quinn Davidson, and Weddleton number 1. It is on page 11, and it is Economic Development Grant to the Anchorage Economic Development Corporation. Who would like to speak to this amendment?
Weddleton would be happy to. I apologize for the length of the thing where it's got description of the amendment and the rationale. I cut down what I'd written to about a fifth. The current budget has no funding for the Anchorage Economic Development Corporation, which is something that the city has founded actually in 1987, and then went independent a few years later. But we've helped fund it significantly since then for very good reasons, because every city should have an economic development branch. And in this case, we get a very productive one with 5 to 6 employees, dozens of very active community members, fairly high up in the totem pole of getting things done. And we get that for the cost of 2 employees. So it's really a bargain having this group, Bill Popp and his team work for the city, essentially. It's notable that in the introduction to the budget and the talk about the state of the economy, that came from the Economic Development Corporation. Last night at the building board meeting, there was discussion about the kind of right sizing the buildings, the inspectors, and that was backed up by Anchorage Economic Development Corporation study or report. So it really is intertwined with what we do within city government, and it is an important role for us. So the need is there. So this addresses that, and we have historically paid for it through a variety of sources, including the the enterprises and utilities that are listed here: port, water utilities, and solid waste services. We also had some from ML&P prior, but with that gone, obviously that's not available. So here we just split it up between the utilities that have generally, pitched in towards it to restore the funding that we've been doing historically. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. So next we'll go to Mr. Presverdia and then Ms. Quinn Davidson. Mr. Presverdia.
Thank you. John hit most of the points that I wanted to share as well. Thank you, John, for doing the bulk of the work on this. I just wanted to add that this really is in alignment with the direction of our new mayor. It is directly in line with the importance of economic development, economic revitalization right now, and it is not the time for us to reduce our investment in AEDC, which leverages this small amount of funds to a significant amount of work towards increasing our labor force, work towards in increasing new businesses to come to our city. So I just really want to encourage my colleagues to support this and to continue to support AEDC as a vital part of getting our businesses and our economy back on track. So thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Presverdia. Ms. Quinn Davidson.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to thank John and Cameron, who did the bulk of work on this, and for inviting me to join them. I just wanted to point out that this amount, $254,000, represents about a quarter of AEDC's revenue for 2022. So that cut would have significant impacts and lead to letting employees go. So just urge support and thank my co-sponsors for all their work.
Thank you, Ms. Quinn Davidson. Before I go to Mr. Constant, I want to note that Ms. Zelatel and Mr. Dunbar have asked to be added as sponsors, as has Mr. Rivera. I would like to be added as a sponsor, and we'll go now to Mr. Constant.
Thank you. I too would like to be added as a sponsor, but I want to speak to the funding source and the rationale and why it makes a lot of sense. I don't know if folks have been following the news, but yesterday it was publicly announced a new program called the ANC PASS program, PASS, Pacific Air to Sea Service. And AEDC, working with the Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport, facilitated a study that demonstrated a new shipping route could exist and could take off the pressure from the juggernaut problem down in LA, the Port of Los Angeles and the Port of Long Beach, which is causing national disaster in the context of getting goods flowing. And the project will move, once it's on its feet, goods from airplanes that land here to fuel to our port, where we send empty ships, 4 empty ships every single week, or 2 empty ships twice a week. So 4 cargo loads south to the port of Tacoma. And they've created, as a response to this crisis, what will be a permanent addition to the access to goods to the United States. And it's all because of the innovation and the hard work. And it very well could create a secondary revenue stream for the Port of Alaska that will be enduring and forever. And so this kind of investment is exactly the kind of investment we need in the future of our city.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. I've added you as a co-sponsor, and Mr. Peterson has asked to be added as well. Okay, seeing no other members in the queue, we will go ahead and move on to the general operating budget and the amendments that don't pertain to the alcohol tax we'll handle first. The first one is Allard number 1. It's regarding the mayor's office community grants, and it is on page 13 of the packet. Ms. Allard?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I like this program. I know everybody supports the AYC, at least I hope you do. My daughters are involved with it. I think this is a great force in the community. One of the reasons why I brought this forward in this manner was went to the administration. They were happy to concede a little bit and compromise with the 50,000. I was a little bit taken back with the conversation I had with a couple of individuals from AYC. They were displeased with the 50,000 grant. They wanted more. I explained that sometimes we get what we can get. And I also went to follow, so I was surprised because they were almost implying that they would turn it down. So I was taken back, but I still want to move forward with this. And the other thing I would bring up is that just to let the assembly members know, we still have the $150,000 that was to be directed to summer camps that just wasn't doled out quick enough during the transition, and other issues had popped up. But with that 150,000, we could eventually, just to give you a little background on why it's only 50,000, disperse a little bit more to the AYC. And also I was considering, with the support of the assembly members, giving the other portion of the 150,000 to victims for justice. But I also wanted to bring up the fact that the AYC did receive more than they ever had from the state, which was $75,000 to the grant to keep them in business. And I urge everybody's support. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Allard. Mr. Weddleton has asked to be added as a co-sponsor, and Ms. Zalatel is in the queue. Ms. Zalatel?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Question for the sponsor. I'm surprised to see a specific entity named in an increase to the mayor's community grants program, because the mayor usually administers those community grants based on whatever the amount that ends up in the budget is. And so I guess I just wanted to ask, is there a specific reason why not to just increase the overall mayor community grants program by $50,000 and have the Anchorage Youth Court apply amongst other agencies, nonprofits, and arts organizations that may also seek that funding?
Yeah, this is a project that I thought needed the 50,000, and so I wanted it designated specifically to them. And I went ahead and worked with Ms. Camacho on it, and with the administration support, we just designated it straight to the AYC, as they've stressed that they need to, in order to going. So that's why we designate it specifically to them. If somebody else wanted to bring a different amendment from any other organization, I would encourage them to do so.
And you're breaking up just a little bit, Ms. Allard. Ms. Zalatel, did you have any follow-up?
No, thank you.
Thank you. Before I move through the queue, I want to note that the amendments are posted online. If members of the public go to muni.org and go to the assembly and then work session page, you can bring them up. So next is Mr. Perez Verdia and then Mr. Constant.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think my question was already asked by Ms. Zalatel, so I'll take myself out of the queue. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Perez Verdia. Mr. Constant?
Thank you. So I have the same question, but I think I have a different take on it. I certainly wondered why it would be in the category of the mayor's grants, because those are a competitive program. My question really is there an alternative location for these funds to go? So we don't create within the grants program an earmarking project, but instead, if we find a grant that we want to support, it could go to another place. So it doesn't make that program muddy, if you will. So my question really is, I guess, to Desiree or the administration, if there's a better place for that, because I support funding the youth court. They do provide a great service. I just don't know that this is the right exact location.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Ms. Camacho or Ms. Demboski, would you like to address Mr. Constant's question?
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is Amy Demboski for the record. When I spoke to Assemblymember Allard about this, my recommended funding source was general operating funds. It was not the mayor's community grants. So I think there might have been just a little miscommunication. I'm sorry if I didn't communicate that well. That's really, I think that would be a cleaner way to do it. But again, it's up to Assemblymember Allard how she wants to present it.
Thank you, Ms. Demboski. Mr. Constant, did you have any follow-up?
Yeah, I think that I would recommend with Ms. Camacho that Ms. Allard considers finding a place within the budget to move these funds. Isn't the community grants? I think that it will be easier for more people to support, because then it doesn't create within that program a funnel for specific projects, and it maintains the integrity of the program as a competition, but could still be supported. If I think it's just simply like, where does the money go is really the question.
Thank you,
There's got to be a place. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Mr. Dunbar?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to ask a clarifying question of the administration. So Ms. Allard just mentioned $150,000 of unspent money, which I assume was either CARES Act or ARPA money that we had set aside for summer camps. Can I get a little more clarity on that? And then was that, I know that Campfire had applied for and gotten a grant, but it hadn't been paid out yet. Is that the $150,000 you're referring to? Is that something else? Am I confusing those two?
No, I don't. Madam Chair, is it okay if I respond?
Go ahead, Ms. Allard.
Yeah, we're doing an audit on that portion to find out exactly where the $150,000 went to with the last administration. So we're looking to redistribute if it wasn't accurately done. But I will double check into that. Thank you, Mr. Dunbar, for the question. But as far as I do want to keep it below the tax cap. I don't want to take it from other needed areas. So we're 100% zeroed in and specifically asked for this 50,000. I don't want to go over the tax cap. I don't want to put out any new bonds or go on any bonds. I'm very conscious of our financial situation in the municipality. And again, I would urge you to support this $50,000 as the administration agreed. And it's not taking away from any other organization within the municipality.
Thank you, Ms. Allard. Ms. Demboski, did you have anything to add regarding Mr. Dunbar's question concerning the 150K? And then I'll go back to you, Mr. Dunbar.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think Marilyn Bonzoff from OMB is on as well, so I'll have her just verify what I'm saying is accurate. What I was trying to express is we're 149,000, maybe Mr. Dunbar's rounding up to 150, under the tax cap in the general operating budget. So I think that's where there might be some confusion. Mr. Dunbar, am I hitting on your question? I've actually
No, I'm sorry. No, I understand that. That's just a coincidence that they're about the same size. So I understand the 140,000 from the tax cap. This is actually a question that Ms. LaFrance asked at a work session, I think yesterday, the day before as well. We've been trying to work with Campfire for a grant that they were supposed to get over the summer that they haven't really been paid out yet. And I think it's about that size. And so I don't know if Marilyn or someone could speak to it, but I'm just making sure that that isn't seen as that wasn't the sort of leftover money we're talking about.
I'll let Marilyn answer that, but I don't believe it is. And I'm actually searching my email right now to see if I have anything else on it, but I don't believe that is this money.
Through the chair, this is Marilyn Ponsoff. I would agree. I would believe that the 150,000 referred to for this funding this amendment would be the amount under the tax cap for 2022.
Thank you, Ms.
Madam Chair.
Bonza. Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Seeing no other members in the queue in this amendment, we will go ahead and move on to the next one in the general operating budget, which is Dunbar, Quinn, Davidson, and Zelatel number 1. It's on page 14 of the packet. And it's also concerning community grants. Which one of you would like to speak first?
I can start, but if either of the others wants to go, I'm happy to defer.
Thank you, Ms. Quinn Davidson.
Okay, I'll just get started. So this is a good amendment to come after Ms. Allard's because we've sort of already talked about the general context. So this amount of money was cut from the mayor's office budget, and then the mayor's office budget saw an increase in mayor's staff. So what we'd like to do is put this 128,873 back into the mayor's office budget with the specific direction to use it on community grants. I actually wasn't as familiar with the community grant program myself until I was in the acting mayor role. And, you know, we funded organizations like the Special Olympics, the Red Cross, Youth Court, as Ms. Allard brought up, Catholic Social Services, Covenant House, Downtown Partnership, Girl Scouts, Campfire, Awake, arts organizations, all kinds of organizations that really contribute to both the culture of our city, but our economy as well. We know that 1 out of 10 folks in the workforce works for a nonprofit. So this will really help and I think makes sense. So yes, I urge support.
Thank you,
Madam Chair,
Ms.
can I add a note to that?
Yes, I have Ms. Zelatel next.
Oh, okay, sorry.
And then I'll go to you, Mr. Dunbar. Ms. Zelatel?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a few things I wanted to add. One is the effect on the organizations that receive these services. Even the cut that's been proposed would be very costly to make up in how they leverage these dollars back into the community. And I would just highlight for members, we received some testimony. It went through the testimony form stack that really did a great breakdown of how these dollars are leveraged. And what I really appreciate is single organizations didn't come forward in support of this. A large group of nonprofit organizations and arts organizations really came forward together to stress the importance of these grants, knowing that not every organization would get them, but that the value added to our community was so important. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Zelatel. And before I go to Mr. Dunbar, I just want to note that Mr. Perez Verdia has been asked to be added as a sponsor. Mr. Dunbar?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'm sure some folks will notice that there's no revenue source on this one yet, and there are several amendments where that was the case. I have sort of committed to Ms. Quinn Davidson to be working over the next 4 days to identify sources of funds for these. Partly it's due to the conversation we had this morning. We know that there is this large potential cost hanging out there with the SROs. We don't have a clear sense of how, the mayor has stated he's going to fully fund it, and we don't have a clear sense of where that money is going to come from. And so if we need to cut somewhere, we want that to sort of follow on the heels of the S version that we expect to see from the administration. So there isn't a revenue source identified right now, but rest assured there will be one on Tuesday night. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Are there any other members who would like to join as co-sponsors to this amendment? Mr. Rivera has requested to be added. Okay, thank you. Seeing no one else in the queue, we will move on to the next operating budget amendment, which is number 1. It is on page 15 of the packet. And prior to EMS, Mr. Weddleton.
Well, thanks. So this is, I think, an oversight in the budget. Doing the continuation budget, the full funding of the agreement with Girdwood EMS was not shown because partway through the year, there was, a movement towards the full funding of the $507,500 that the city municipality is to pay to Girdwood Fire and Rescue for their EMS work. I think we've had this discussion quite a bit at length, the late spring, early summer this year about the contract. So this just fulfills the agreement with the city. The revenue source, I think, should just say area-wide EMS. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Mr. Dunbar has asked to be added as a co-sponsor to this amendment. Ms. Elton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Would there be any objections from the sponsors of looking at whether or not there would be room within the alcohol tax? This appears to be first responder, fit within that first responder bucket, or if that was considered. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Zelatel. Mr. Weddleton?
That it would probably fit, but this is, part of the greater EMS system. And in fact, the EMS work was being done prior to 2020, the baseline for the alcohol tax. It was just never really funded. Girdwood Fire and Rescue does work, most of their EMS work is outside of their area where they tax themselves and done on the Seward Highway. So this helps cover that. I mean, they're basically abandoning their area to go do stuff outside of their service area and not getting funded for it until this agreement. And this agreement was many years in the work. So it really should be standard part of area-wide EMS. It should be shown as a separate line item so that every year you can track where it is. So I don't think it would really be needed or appropriate in the alcohol tax. Thanks though.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Any follow-up, Ms. Zelatel?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll think on that a little bit. I support this amendment. I'm happy to be added. I'd want to explore or think about the fund source just a little bit more, because this seems like when we had a service already in the budget and we decided to add additional funds onto it, that was an appropriate alcohol tax usage. So, but please add me to this. I think it's important, and I look forward to discussing the fund source. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Zelatel. I will go ahead and add you as a co-sponsor to this amendment. Do any other members wish to be added or have any questions? I don't see anyone else in the queue, and we are we're an hour into our time, and I think we're doing okay as far as moving through these amendments, but we'll go ahead and get to the next one here, which is Constant Dunbar and Quinn Davidson. Number 1, department is building services. This one is on page 16 of your packet. Who would like to speak to this amendment?
I guess I could get us started.
Thank you,
This
Mr.
is
Davidson.
awesome. Yeah, thank you, Ms. LaFrance. So I have a lot of concern about reducing, eliminating any of these inspectors. I think sort of as a bigger picture, we're looking at two problems that would come from it. One is it's a safety issue, right? And having been through the earthquake of 2018 and seeing what happened in my neighborhood, I don't want to see that happening across the city. And so I think it's a big safety issue that the mayor is proposing. I'm also worried about delays. So all of these inspections have to happen in order for construction to move forward. So I just think this is really the wrong time to be eliminating inspectors and slowing down construction when we need to see our economy moving forward. So I'll let the other sponsors, if they want to speak to specifics. I guess I'll throw out one more thing before I do, which is I know that there has not been a reduction in the number of inspections being performed. So there's no reason to be doing this. It's been steady at about 1,500 inspections a year, at least for the electrical, for about 4 years. So I don't really see a need for this amendment, and I also see harm that comes from it. Thank you. Or I mean, from the budget as proposed. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Quinn Davidson. And I want to note that Mr. Perez-Verdia and Ms. Zelatel have asked to be added as co-sponsors, as well as Mr. Rivera and myself. Do the other original sponsors, Mr. Constant or Mr. Dunbar, want to add anything?
The only thing I'll add is I think we all expect and hope for there to be a boom in construction in the next year and 2 years and going forward with the large influx of federal funding. So this just seems like the wrong time to be downsizing this department. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar, and Mr. Peterson has asked to be added as a co-sponsor. Mr. Constant, did you want to add anything as one of the original sponsors?
I just want to offer that 3 times this week I directed people to code enforcement, and it's probably one of the top 2 or 3 places I have in terms of constituent work to send people. And I'm dependent on code enforcement, and we need code enforcement because there are just so many different things, whether it's cannabis shops that are smelling, whether it's other issues that are really important to people in my district. This is probably one of the top areas.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Ms. Kennedy?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess my question to the sponsors on this would be in regard to potentially doing this in hopes of the funding that we might be getting from the federal level. Wouldn't the inspectors needed for those projects actually be funded through those projects? And I know that is very typical of what happens with school projects. Whoever is needed to manage the projects actually gets funded in the money that comes for those projects. So I'm thinking we might be jumping the gun on this. So I just kind of like some feedback on what kind of conversations they would have about where real funding would actually, who would be responsible for the funding of these additional inspectors should we have the additional work. Thanks.
Can I speak to that, Madam Chair, since I raised the issue?
Yes, go ahead, Mr. Dunbar.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I think as Ms. Quinn Davidson pointed out, we've seen the numbers constant between 1,500 and 1,600 a year the last several years. So even absent an influx of federal funds, this is still necessary. I think there's just going to be incredible pressure on the entire construction industry, and I'm already talking to people in the trades about this, about the lack of skilled labor in this city to do basically every stage of every kind of construction, and so to lose these really highly qualified and trained inspectors in the municipality, I think the impact of those large projects, even if they're well funded, is going to put pressure on our labor force throughout the municipality. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Any follow-up, Ms. Kennedy?
Yeah, I guess a little bit, so the idea is then to just keep them in there as a placeholder for when things do start to pick up, because right now we're actually under the construction numbers that we've had even in last year. So I thought the whole concept was the fact that that the building services doesn't need these people right now, and there's just not enough for them to do. So anyway, again, I'm just trying to figure out, is this the idea of keeping employees so you don't lose them when you might need them, you know, kind of hanging on to them for some time in the future? Or would we be better served with just waiting to see what kind of projects actually get funded and then hiring for the need at that point? So that's what I'm wrestling with. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kennedy. Mr. Constant?
Yeah, thanks. It's a very interesting conundrum, the chicken and the egg. The fact is, no single project pays for an inspector or a plumbing inspector. You know, any of these would never be covered by a specific project for their whole-time work. But not having them available is what puts a bottleneck on projects going forward. And we hear time and time again that the issue is people can't get building, can't get inspections. So for me, you got to have the capacity to deliver the service. If you have to wait to train and ramp up, then that is, you know, the cost of time is money.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. And we can get into debate on this one on Tuesday. I don't see anyone else in the queue. And just to recap, I've added Mr. Perez-Verdia, Ms. Zalatel, Mr. Rivera, and Mr. Peterson, and as well as myself as additional sponsors to this amendment. We'll go ahead and move on to the next one, which is LaFrance number 1, pertaining to $20,000 to the clerk's office. This is on page 17. And I'll just go ahead and speak briefly to this. This amount covers the increase required to, this is to BDO, to cover the costs for the audits for the 2022 plan, which it covers the 2021 year. This is a contract to BDO, which is an assembly contract, and it's managed by Ms. Camacho. So if there are any specific questions, Ms. Camacho can address those here. Okay, seeing no one in the queue, we'll go ahead and move on to the next amendment. This is LaFrance number 2, $20,000 to Assembly Council. And this is to cover the cost, the increased costs of interpreting services. And this amendment is on page 18 of the packet. Are there any questions? Okay, seeing no members in the queue, I will move on to LaFrance number 3.
Yes, LaFrance.
Oh,
I'm
yes,
sorry.
Mr. Constant?
I'm sure. You can go ahead and add me to all of these clerk's office ones as a sponsor.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. That'll be LaFrance 1, 2, and then 3, which I'm going to speak to in a minute, and 4 and 5. So LaFrance Constant number 3 proposes $10,000 to the Assembly office. This is on page 19 of your packet, and this will allow for an increase in closed captioning for Assembly meetings. Are there any questions? Seeing no one in the queue, I will move on to the next amendment. Actually, Mr. Rivera has asked to be added as a co-sponsor for the closed captioning amendment. And Ms. Kennedy, you are in the queue. Go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And first, I just want to say that the Teams app is still having some quirky things going on. It's incredibly slow in terms of trying to get the chat to function. So anyway, just kind of want to make that comment. I've been kicked off once already as well. So anyway, just issues going on still. But my question in the previous one about closed captioning, is that something that's done internally? Is that something done through some kind of IT service, or where does that 10,000 go? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kennedy. Ms. Camacho, would you be able to address Ms. Kennedy's question?
Yes, through the chair to Ms. Kennedy. We have a contract with a vendor who does closed captioning for the meetings. We've been using them for a number of years. The rate's been steady, just the number of assembly meetings and hours have increased, and we need to accommodate for that.
Okay, thank you. So it's based, if I might, Madam Chair.
Go ahead, Ms. Kennedy.
So it's based on additional requirements for the closed captioning. It's not that their costs have gone up. It's just actually we pay for closed captioning like per event or per meeting. Is that how that works?
It's an hourly rate.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Kennedy. I want to note that in the queue, Ms. Zalatel has asked to be added as a sponsor for all amendments addressing increases in assembly and elections costs. Are there any other questions or comments? Seeing no one else in the queue, and thank you for pointing out, Ms. Kennedy, that it's taking some time to get in the queue with Teams. I will make an effort here to pause a little more before moving on. We'll go ahead and move on to what is now the France Constant Amendment number 4 in Zalatel. This is $90,300 for elections, and this is to cover advertising costs related to noticing and advertising municipal elections. There are increases to printing and binding costs as well. I see in the chat that Mr. Perez-Verdia has asked to be added on. And Mr. Perez-Verdia, is that just for this amendment here? Mr.
No,
Perez-Verdia?
Yeah, no, I'm sorry, I want to be added to all the ones related to the assembly elections cost, please.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Perez-Verdia. I will add you for all the assembly and elections amendments. And Mr. Rivera has asked to be added as a co-sponsor for this amendment. And then Mr. Peterson has asked to be added for La France 1 through 4. Okay, did I get everybody? Don't see anyone else in the queue. Okay, we can go ahead and actually Ms. Kennedy is in the queue. Go ahead, Ms. Kennedy.
Sorry, Madam Chair, thank you. You know, I guess just to reiterate what the potential revenue sources for all these amendments were, there were several. And obviously we were, you know, for this to go under the general fund, we're way over the tax cap at this point. So anyway, just would appreciate some thoughts about what people are thinking as to where the revenue is coming from. Maybe not specifically at this point, but just some of the thoughts that might be out there about potentially where the funds might come from. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Kennedy. And I actually would go back to what Mr. Dunbar said earlier about some big items, the SROs being added to the budget, and clearly we'll need to identify revenue sources, and we'll have that by Tuesday's meeting.
Okay, so there's no potential ideas out there yet. Thank you.
I have some potential ideas, but am still working with Desiree and looking at other possibilities.
Okay, all right, thank you. I'll look forward to the conversation on Tuesday. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Kennedy.
Madam Chair, I'm sorry, I
Yes.
can't get into, just like Ms. Kennedy's having the same issues, I can't get into the queue. Do you mind if I just make a quick comment?
Go ahead, Ms. Quinn Davidson. And we're picking up some background noise too. If folks who aren't speaking could please mute. Go ahead, Ms. Quinn Davidson.
Thank you. And I guess this is a comment and also a question to the administration. I think in part the funding source depends on what we see as an S version from them. And so I'd like to, I guess it would be Ms. Domboski or the mayor. Do you plan to submit an S version? We did hear you mention adding the Girdwood Transit 20,000 back. Will there be other changes? What do you think will happen with the SROs? Any information you can give us will help us determine the revenue sources as quickly as we can. Thank you.
Through the chair, Assembly Member Quinn Davidson, thank you for the question. And I did expect we would be bringing forward an S version. As we got through this, really the only change that the administration is going to be recommending is going to be the change to the Glacier Valley Transit. So we were planning on, just last night we made the decision, we're planning on just doing an amendment. And so I do not anticipate an S version at this time.
Thank you, Ms. Domboski. Any follow-up, Ms. Quinn Davidson?
No, sorry, Madam Chair, I just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Quinn Davidson. Okay, seeing no other members in the queue, we can go ahead and move on to the next amendment, which is LaFrance number 5. This amendment proposes to add a 1 headcount FTE, Special Administrative Assistant 1, to the Assembly's office. And this is in response to some of the conversations that have come up, particularly surrounding expanding the use of Teams Live, expanding the use of technology-based participation in meetings, in expanding the use of phone testimony. And we spoke a little bit at the Rules Committee meeting about what members would like to see in terms of where the Assembly might go with offering more options to the public and to members for participation. And as you recall from that meeting, it's a staffing issue. And Ms. Camacho, I believe, and Ms. Jones also spoke to how it is very labor intensive to staff Teams Live meetings. And so I put this one in here because I think it's very important for us to consider what resources would be required in order to provide the level of service that members of the public have asked us to provide in terms of technology and participation. Ms. Zalatel?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to speak to this briefly, and one of the reasons I'm supporting this is the increased work of the clerk's office and the assembly offices. Really, you know, it falls to the clerk's office. I had this issue raised very clearly by a constituent last night after community council. That in addition to, you know, the ongoing records request, I think this just makes really good sense, and I appreciate the chair for putting this together. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Zalatel. Ms. Zalatel, did you want to be added to this one?
Oh, yes, I thought I asked to be added to all of the assembly and elections-based amendments in the packet. Thank you. You did, and I have a note adding you to all those. So I've added you, and I've added Mr. Perez-Verdia and then Mr. Rivera to this amendment, and Mr. Constant is on here as well. Okay, seeing no other members in the queue,
We will go ahead then and move on, continuing with the general operating budget amendments. This is the first one that pertains to the alcohol tax revenues. It is LaFrance and Weddleton Amendment number 2, APD and AFD Alcohol Tax Program. Mr. Weddleton?
Sure, thanks. So this is, there's been frustration in Girdwood that, you know, they contribute, or their business is there, and I suppose the individuals drinking contribute quite a lot to the alcohol tax, but the focus of the programs that we've funded have really been mostly in the Anchorage Bowl and maybe some in Eagle River, though it might be thinner there as well. So they reviewed their needs, and they're not really asking for a lot here. I think it's typical Girdwood fashion that they're just focusing on, you know, practical sense. What's the minimum we need? And they just want to be trained. And they say train with your police, which we know police is Girdwood, on the various skills that the Anchorage Police Department has, crisis intervention training. And Girdwood Fire and Rescue is often the first responder when there's an issue that could be an individual having a mental problem or whatever. And so they're looking for training there as well. So this is basically a request, tallies up, I suppose, the costs that they would face for staffing to go to those meetings. And they're requesting just simply that amount to be covered. So, and the revenue source is basically to just plug this not quite $17,000 into the $750,000 that is now in there for the mobile crisis team. And just for your comparison with everyday things, I've kind of calculated roughly that this is about less than 100 drinks per day per person in wherever, and I'm sure Girdwood covers that amply. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. There are 3 members who have asked to be added as co-sponsors to this amendment: Mr. Dunbar, Ms. Zalatel, and Mr. Rivera. And Mr. Dunbar is in the queue.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I asked to be added as a co-sponsor because I do support this this allocation. However, I think just looking at the other amendments we're going to have, I don't think that the funding source is what I would recommend. And so just I guess as a preview, I might add an amendment to this amendment after we go through the other amendments on the night of. I think that there is funding within the alcohol tax that we can find for this, though. I just don't think that police mobile crisis team contract is going to exist once we're done with this process. So anyway, just I guess as a preview for the sponsor, even though I'm becoming co-sponsor. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar.
Madam Chair.
Go ahead, Mr. Weddleton.
You know, if that is going to happen as we prepare the packet with the various amendments, consider putting this after any that Mr. Dunbar might do, so that if, you know, his future amendments pass, then we can, you know, have a clear way to switch this one around. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Ms. Quinn Davidson has asked to be added as a co-sponsor to this amendment. I'm just pausing to give any members an opportunity to get in the queue. Okay, I don't see anyone else. We can go ahead and move on to the next amendment, which is Weddleton number 1. It is on page 24 of the packet, and it is to the Health Department. Mr. Weddleton?
Thanks. This is similar to what we did last year. We gave $125,000 to Victims for Justice and a similar amount to Awake. And in that case, we had a separate line item we added on in first quarter budget amendments. And this takes that amount and just plugs it into the continuation dollars that is in the mayor's budget. But it just calls out to give these amounts to these groups.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Mr. Dunbar has requested to be added as a co-sponsor. I would also like to be added as a co-sponsor. Ms. Zalatel is in the queue.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm a little bit curious. Does this add back in the $250,000, or does it dedicate from the $1,750,000 that was that remained in the proposed alcohol tax budget?
This would not be an increase. It would just say of that amount, make sure that these $225,000 amounts go to these two groups.
And may I do a follow-up question?
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. I know we did these two groups last year as specific grantees, I guess that's the best way to say it, because there was a delay in getting the alcohol tax funds out. Is there a particular reason to call these folks out instead of having the health department administer the full amount of this particular bucket through a competitive grant process? I believe that grant process was pretty well spelled out in the alcohol tax that had to, show performance measures, et cetera.
I'd have to reread the ballot, but I don't recall the performance measures, but perhaps. This is the federal program, the Voca program is still not fully funded, and this is to help really, I think, for victims for justice in a large extent, the amount that they lost from not getting that, and they don't expect that to be restored for a couple of years. And Awake actually got, I think, 400,000 or 500,000 from the Voca program, and this is just a little, third or quarter of what they typically got. So it's replacing that source of funds that they've lost for a period of time.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. That's really helpful.
Thank you, Ms. Zalatel. I have Mr. Rivera in the queue, and then Mr. Perez-Verdia, and then Ms. Quinn Davidson. Mr. Rivera?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I guess we'll get to this when we get to Dunbar and Quinn Davidson Amendment number 3 on page 29. But to me, the two seem to be very similar, except that the former amendment, Dunbar and Quinn Davidson number 3, appears to increase the alcohol tax revenue to accommodate these funds versus using what is already in the budget. So I guess I'll just wait to hear the rationale for the two different versions when we get to the amendment on page 29. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Rivera. Mr. Perez-Verdia?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I guess I need to go back and just understand what Mr. Weddleton said. Before I ask the question, I'm concerned about identifying specific nonprofit organizations who would normally be funded through a competitive grant process. I feel like it sets the wrong precedent to identify specific organizations and bypass that competitive process, because I think it's important in terms of being fair and allocating funds in a very sort of thoughtful and organized way, even though I'm a fan of these two organizations and believe they both should be funded. So that's my first point I wanted to make, that I know there was another organization identified earlier in our discussion. I just think that's a practice we should avoid generally. But I guess I'm trying to understand whether that's what this is, and maybe Mr. Weddleton can explain. Is this bypassing the competitive grant process and funding two organizations, or is this something else in terms of replacing lost funds? I thought I heard you say that they had lost money and this is replacing funds. Is that correct? Maybe you can give me what you said again so I can understand the rationale behind this.
I think the answer is yes to both of those questions. This is specifically directing funds towards these groups, and this is something we did last year. So it's not without precedence. And it is also an attempt to replace the funds that they lost through a federal program that won't be restored for a few years.
I see. Okay. All right. Thanks. I would just, my last comment is I realize that we do this occasionally. I just think we should be cautious in identifying specific organizations, although I do support these particular organizations. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Perez-Verdia. Ms. Quinn Davidson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And like Mr. Rivera said, I know we have the amendments coming later, but just sort of as a preview, I think I definitely support assisting these two organizations. I think they're in unique spaces financially due to the Voca issue that I think was pretty well explained in some of the testimony we got. So I support giving them one-time grants. At the same time, I don't think we should direct the health department to use the 1.75 million for grants that's in the alcohol tax proposed budget. I think that should be separate, and we should use leftover one-time funds available through the alcohol tax that have spilled over from this year. And then at the same time, I think we should increase the 1.75 sort of continuing budget to 2 million. And that's what the other amendment is, you'll see, because our alcohol tax is going to go up. You know, we're expected to get about 500,000 over, as Mr. Moore and Mr. Frisk were describing yesterday. This year, I would assume that would happen next year as well. And we'll also have another month to add. So we're going to have a little money to work with. And I think it's only fair, since this is one of the three buckets, the evidence-based grants, that goes up by 250,000 if we're, you know, getting over $1 million more, probably closer to 2. So anyway, that I think there are two different issues going on, but I wouldn't support something that didn't raise the overall amount of grants. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Quinn Davidson. Mr. Weddleton?
Yeah, I'm not stuck on this way of doing it as a source of funds. So I think, I guess, pair these up on Tuesday, and you could put the Austin's first and see how that goes, and then perhaps not move this one is fine. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Does anyone else want in the queue? Okay, seeing no other members in the queue, we'll go ahead and move on to Dunbar and Quinn Davidson, number 1. This is concerning the health department. Who would like to speak first?
If I could, Madam Chair.
Go ahead, Mr. Dunbar.
So a number of these, and obviously we at the budget committee, we've been having very detailed discussions about the budget and the alcohol tax. A number of these amendments sort of fit together. And so I'm hopeful that we can, just like the example of the last one, which would be paired with one of the latter amendments, we can kind of go through these in a thoughtful order on Tuesday night. And this is probably one of the ones that needs to go first. So what this does is it shifts from the alcohol tax to the general operating budget, $1.3 million worth of these permanent positions, like you can see them listed all there. And this one obviously needs to go first because some of the following amendments rely on these funds that have been freed up in the alcohol tax.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Ms. Quinn Davidson, did you want to add anything?
No, I'm good, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Quinn Davidson.
Could I add one thing to Ms. LaFrance? And this just occurred to me. This also means I would suggest to my colleagues that we take up the alcohol tax discussion before we take up the general operating budget discussion on Tuesday night, because this obviously is going to shift $1.3 million over to the general operating budget, and then we'll have to discuss revenue sources on that side. So this I think should happen first.
Thank you for that suggestion, Mr. Dunbar. I'll go ahead and go through the queue first. Mr. Perez-Rudia has asked to be added as a co-sponsor to this amendment, and then I'll go to Ms. Zalatel next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I generally agree with what this amendment's trying to do. I would just raise that if there excuse me, is room in the alcohol tax where health department positions can really focus on those areas that the alcohol tax targets. And here I'm talking about the epidemiologist. I've been doing some research into what epidemiologists can do, and there's really a unique opportunity perhaps to fund the epidemiologist with alcohol tax funds and allow that person to really guide our work under particularly the domestic violence, child abuse, sexual assault buckets, as they are related determinants of public health. So just an idea to throw out there and to be considered as we move forward. I know We really have focused in on an epidemiologist as it really relates to COVID, but looking forward and a forward investment in how to be as strategic perhaps with the alcohol tax dollars, maybe even a portion of the epidemiologist time dedicated to such services might be a good choice. So something to think about as we move towards Tuesday. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Zalatel. Are there any other members who have questions or comments? Seeing no one else in the queue, we'll go ahead and move on to the next one. We have just under 25 minutes left, and we have 4 amendments remaining. This next one is Dunbar, Quinn, Davidson, and Zalatel number 2. It is on page 26, and it pertains to the fire department. Which one of you would like to speak first?
I will, Madam Chair. This is Ms. Zalatel. So this would be a continuation of the mobile crisis team in its current iteration. This is proposed to move forward for a couple of reasons, and we'll talk about, sorry, my dog. We'll talk about it a little bit more on Monday at the work session, but I think this provides us an opportunity to explore whether or not there's capacity in the private sector to bring on mobile crisis using clinicians and really getting some time to study this. I think this is a great way to provide funding while we explore other options and consider them without disrupting the current service, which has become, I think, really important to our community. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Zalatel. Do either of the 2 original sponsors wish to speak further to this amendment? Mr. Dunbar, it looks like you've unmuted. Did you want to speak?
Oh, sorry, I was just leaving myself unmuted. No, I mean, I agree with what Meg said, and yeah, and you can see obviously the fund sources reliant on the shift that we made in the prior amendment. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. And Mr. Perez-Verdia and Mr. Rivera have asked to be added as co-sponsors, and I would like to be added as well. I'll go next to Mr. Perez-Verdia, actually, and Mr. Peterson would like to be added too. So Mr. Perez-Verdia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, this is one of those that I think if all of us could have been, not all of us, but if a lot of us could have been involved in working on, many of us were involved in having conversations around this and learning about this and feeling really strongly that for right now, the mobile crisis team needs to remain at the fire department. It needs to continue to build and progress in the really successful work that it's doing. And then there needs to be a long-term conversation about where it ultimately should be. And I'm looking forward to that. But it's really important, I think, to me at least, that this work that so many people have put so much effort into building continues, especially as we look at building the crisis now model within our community. And so I'm just a real strong, really strongly in support of this, of restoring this funding and keeping it in AFD and allowing that work to continue, and then having some really thoughtful conversations in the future about how it should look down the road. So thanks for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Perez-Verdia. Ms. Allard?
Thank you, Madam Chair. How many are already on here for the amendment as far as co-sponsors, please?
Sure. In addition to members Dunbar, Quinn, Davidson, and Zalatel, Mr. Perez-Verdia, Mr. Rivera, Mr. Peterson, and myself are on there. So it's a total of 7.
7. Okay, thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Allard. Are there any other questions or comments? Seeing no one else in the queue, we will go ahead and move on to Perez Verdia, Quinn Davidson, and Zelatel number 1. This is on page 27, and it pertains to the health department. Who would like to speak first?
Sure, this is Ms. Zelatel. I'll kick it off. This restores $1 million to the early childhood funding and is intended to make this more of a continuation from the FY21 levels. I think this is what's needed to really balance out the alcohol tax and really be mindful of the upstream investments versus just responding to crisis type services with these funds, which was the intention of the tax. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Zelatel.
Yeah, this is Mr. Presverdi. I just would just ditto what Ms. Zelatel said, and I think most of us have at least heard or understand the importance of this upstream work. You know, it's not the time to be reducing this. It's the time to be increasing this. The investment we're making in early childhood is going to pay huge dividends for us in all areas, whether it's health or public safety or the overall vitality of our community. And so I think it's really important that we put this funding back and we can continue the work of investing more and more in early childhood. This is not nearly enough, but it's a good start. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Perez Verdia. I would like to be added as a co-sponsor to this amendment, as would Mr. Peterson and Mr. Rivera and Mr. Dunbar. Are there any other members who would like to be added or wish to get in the queue? Okay, seeing no one else in the queue. Actually, I got a message from Mr. Constance who would like to be added to the MCT amendment. So Ms. Camacho, if you could note that Mr. Constant would like to be added to the MCT amendment. Okay, we'll go ahead then and move on to the next amendment, which is Dunbar and Quinn Davidson number 2. It's on page 28 of the packet, and it pertains to the health department. Who would like to speak to this amendment?
Austin, do you want to speak to the underlying substance, and then I'll talk to the revenue? Austin?
Sure. Yeah. Sorry, I'm here. I'm just thinking what I would want to say. I think I sort of covered it earlier. You know, it's so interesting. We brought this alcohol tax proposal. You know, the first one since sort of the crew of us have been around. It's obviously not the first one in history that focused mostly on homelessness. It failed, and then some groups like Recover Alaska and others, Theory of Change groups got involved and saw that really what the public was looking for was an alcohol tax that also focused on prevention. So not just the downstream homelessness solutions, but the upstream, like Mr. Perez Verdia talked about, early education, or at least evidence-based grants, you know, stopping child abuse, for instance, and sort of the financial and obviously other benefits that has to a community. So for me, I think that there should be a somewhat even split between the three categories, and that's what the public intended through voting on it that way. I also, you know, we're going to see an increase in the alcohol tax next year, and so again, like I said earlier, I think 250 is not much to add in the grand scheme. Go ahead, Forrest.
Thanks, Austin. Thank you, Madam Chair. I was just going to say, you can see on the prior amendment regarding the AHD and this one as well, that we have budgeted some additional alcohol tax revenue, and I'm sorry, for the early education grants and for this one, or some additional alcohol tax revenue, and that follows these really detailed discussions we've had at the budget committee. We are collecting more alcohol tax this year than we expected. The projection of the administration does include January, but sort of ramps it back to the kind of to where we thought we were going to be, as opposed to where we actually ended up. And so, as the budget chair and working with Ms. Quinn Davidson, and also thinking about some of the initial projections we did on the alcohol tax, we sort of took a conservative to kind of middle conservative view of what this would raise. And if you remember last year, we were particularly conservative in what we decided to allocate. And the alcohol tax, for better or worse, has dramatically overperformed. And so I think there's going to be between $1 and $2 million more of alcohol tax revenue available to us next year, over and above what the administration is now projecting. But these two amendments take a more conservative view and project $750,000 about of additional revenue split between these two amendments from the alcohol tax. Now, I'll say, we can always come back at first quarter budget revisions and revise them back down if for some reason the fourth quarter of this year underperforms what we think the fourth quarter is going to do. We also have some unspent alcohol tax money that's going to roll over, so that could potentially plug a hole next year too. But I think projecting $750,000 of additional alcohol tax money is a conservative estimate. And so we have used that in two of these amendments. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Mr. Perez-Verdia, Ms. Zalatel, and Mr. Rivera have asked to be added as co-sponsors, and Mr. Weddleton is in the queue.
So maybe this goes into debate, and you could give me the hook, Madam Chair. But if this is, it's it's just, I guess, adding 25% to what's there or less, more, slider eighth to it. Maybe this kind of amendment would be better wait till April rather than putting it out there now. If the revenues don't come the way we hope, then we've kind of put this promise out there, but not been able to meet it. I'd rather under promise and then in April, make good on it. If our revenues come, are at the amount that you expect.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Do the sponsors want to speak to the decision to bring this amendment forward now versus waiting in April?
I guess I would just say.
I think.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Forrest.
No, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Austin.
Okay, I guess I would just say it's a decent point. I see what you're saying, but I also think it's incredibly unlikely. I mean, we would have to see a downtrend in alcohol tax revenues for this not to be possible. So I guess could see both ways to do it, but to me, it makes sense to do it this way because we're pretty certain we're going to get this revenue.
Thank you, Ms. Quinn Davidson. Any follow-up, Mr. Weddleton?
No, thank you.
Ms. Zalatel?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would just add for consideration on this that this will run through the Health Department, and the Health Department is extremely diligent in its contracting and grant administration, which can take it some time. So I would like to give them as much lead time on getting their process set out with the with full funding as early as possible, so these monies can get into the community. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Zalatel. Okay, seeing no other members in the queue, we will move on to the last amendment in our packet, which is page 29, Dunbar and Quinn Davidson, number 3. This pertains to the Health Department. Who would like to speak to this amendment? Mr. Dunbar?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll just say this is why we do this work session, right? So this is John's amendment. Perhaps we can find a way to merge them. I think, actually, even looking at this myself, I think it probably makes more sense, as I think Ms. Quinn Davidson said, to use the rollover one-time fund for this, because these two organizations have that really unique Voca issue. Yeah. But I think we all want to fund these organizations. I hope we do, at least.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Mr. Weddleton? Or
If they're done on this one, I have another one that I sent, still fairly undeveloped to Desiree, but I wanted to bring it up when it's appropriate.
okay, thanks. I just saw your note there in the queue. Do members have any questions for the sponsors on this amendment? Okay, I don't see anyone in the queue. We can go ahead and go back to you, Mr. Weddleton.
Okay, thanks. So another one that I've been working on is looking at the reorganization, and we've got in the building safety department basically a new position. You've got the role filled by Adam, and then there was Ron Thompson, and then you have the building official, which was Bob Dole, and then Michelle McNulty for planning, which kind of adds a tier in there. And what I would intend to propose is for streamlining and kind of right sizing, as we're doing in that department, is removing the Ron Thompson position and put Ron Thompson, I don't know how that would technically done, make available to him the building official role. So you just kind of take out someone in the middle, and that would save a couple $100,000. And where that would go, could go towards rebuilding the building safety service area fund, or also I was thinking of putting that towards one of the administrative positions that's funded with the alcohol tax. I'm not quite sure where that'll land, but I just think we see added a position that doesn't seem to be necessary.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Ms. Zalatel says she would like to join your verbal amendment. And Mr. Constant had a comment about wanting to merge all the assembly branch items into one amendment. And then Mr. Dunbar, you were in the queue.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Regarding the reorganization, I'll say also, we actually have the reorganization ordinance, right? And the budget is sort of predicated on reorganization in a variety of ways. And so I'm just flagging for folks, I intend to bring an amendment to undo the merging of the library into the Parks Department. And that will then require, I believe, a conforming amendment to sort of undo the planned reorganization within the budget. It won't change the dollar amount because there are no projected savings from that reorganization, but it will change kind of the line items. And so I guess I'm just flagging that for folks that it's going to be a little bit of a challenge if people are planning to bring amendments to the reorganization. This reorganization, we're just getting it a little bit later than maybe we had hoped. And I know that, Madam Chair, you had scheduled, I believe, for the Tuesday following a special meeting. I could be mistaken about that, but I guess putting it on people's radar that I would be surprised if we're able to get through the general government operating budget on Tuesday night, given the volume of amendments and the challenges with reorganization. So I would suggest that if we can, we take up the utility budgets and we take up the capital budgets, and we I hopefully get those done on Tuesday night. Then we take up reorganization and the alcohol tax. I mean, whichever way people prefer. And then sort of the final thing we tackle is the general government operating budget, because again, it seems to be predicated on several other ordinances and measures being passed. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Before I go through the queue, and there are a number of folks who want to be added to the library amendment, I want to note for members that, as Mr. Dunbar mentioned, yes, we have set aside Tuesday, November 30th for a special meeting for any public hearings that we need to hold for budget items that we do not get to on the meeting of the 23rd. Per the code, if we do not take up the budget item, those that require 2 public hearings within a certain time frame, then we need to have another public hearing. So we have a plan in place in the event we don't get to the general operating budget on Tuesday. So to go back through the queue and make sure I've captured everything here, because it sort of suddenly exploded. On the amendment to enter the library from the Parks Department, I know it's not in this packet and pertains to the reorganization. Mr. Constant, Mr. Perez-Verdia, Ms. Quinn Davidson, Ms. Zalatel, and Mr. Rivera would like to join that. And then going back through the queue for people who wanted to speak, I think Mr. Weddleton, you are next, and then Mr. Perez-Verdia. Mr. Weddleton.
Okay, yeah, I was looking for clarification, maybe from the administration. So for an amendment that would be to maybe just remove funding for the position that Ron Thompson is now, is that reorganization or just purely a budget thing? I mean, I guess that's just to help me know where to put this.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Ms. Dombowski?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Weddleton, that position is actually created in the reorg. Right now, it's in a temporary PCN, so it's created in the reorg. So I would assume that if you wanted to X out that position, you would do so in the reorganization. And then once you did that, it would obviously have a domino effect and be impacted in the budget. There's probably a line item there is a line item in development services as well. So you may have to do it in both places, but I would recommend you ask Assembly Council just to be sure. But my expectation would be it would probably have to be in both places.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. And I want to note that Mr. Peterson would like to join Mr. Dunbar's library amendment. Going back through the queue, Mr. Perez-Verdia, and then Mr. Constant, and we have about 2 minutes left. Mr. Perez-Verdia?
You can take me out of the queue. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Perez-Verdia. Mr. Constant?
Thank you. I guess this is probably also a conversation for council and Assembly Finance aides. I wonder if we contemplate the reorganization, because it's after the budget, it was introduced after, we haven't had a time to thoughtfully consider it in the context of all of the moving parts, that we can pass the budget and then we can amend the org chart and revise the budget backwards if we find we need to. And so I think we need to have a conversation internally with leadership maybe and council on how those two elements can work together and how we can address them, because it's difficult to be moving two different tracks that are supposed to be on the same track. And so I'm not quite sure how we do that tactically yet. So I'm looking forward to figuring that out with our staff.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Mr. Dunbar?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to say that for the folks that were joining the library amendment, I'm going to interpret that as both joining the amendment that will impact the reorganization and any conforming budgetary amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. And okay, Ms. Quinn Davidson says yes, and Ms. Zalatel says yes, and if there's anyone who does not want to be, oh, Mr. Peterson says yes. If you don't want to be, just go ahead and speak up, otherwise we will assume yes. Okay, it is just about, it is 3 p.m. actually now, and we have a 3:30 special meeting today in room 155. Mr. Perez-Verdia says yes. Ms. Allard, very briefly, and then Ms. Quinn Davidson, very briefly. Ms. Allard?
Thank you. I will move what we were talking about in my prior amendment. We'll take it from the general funds, and I've already sent everything to Desiree, so that will help everybody be more supportive of it. So I'll take care of that, just so everybody knows.
Thank you, Ms. Allard. Ms. Quinn Davidson?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to point out that Mr. Dunbar mentioned it at the beginning, but I think that there are some amendments we're seeing to the bond. Some of us, I've been talking with community councils, some of us are still working through potential amendments. So just wanted to let everyone know that it's likely that Mr. Perez-Verdia and I would bring something in our district, but we just haven't put that together yet with all of the moving parts in the operating budget. So probably beyond the Tuesday meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Quinn Davidson. And I see that someone has their hand up, but I can't tell who that is.
That's me, Mr. Gates.
Oh, go ahead, Mr. Gates.
Yes, so just briefly, like Mr. Constant touched on, with the reorganization ordinance and the budget and having them be in alignment. Ideally, the reorganization will be done before you approve the budget. And however, the operations of government are not always cleanest and ideal. And so this happens. And the fact of the matter is, though, that there will be a little reconciliation actions to make sure that they do align at some point and as early as possible as we can, maybe by amendment to the reorg chart or by some budget amendments. It's a complex process here, but I trust that in January or maybe by the end of December, we have reconciliation actions necessary so that they do align, and that's within our powers. So although we don't have that in place, the sky is not going to fall, City Hall is not going to crumble into rubble. We will continue to operate, reconcile these things.
Thank you, Mr. Gates. And we have two more members in the queue. Before I go to Ms. Kennedy and Mr. Constant, and we are past our time, which I understand with a work session, we typically can roll over a little, but I do ask that you go quickly with your comments. And I did want to reiterate what we heard from the administration, that an S version is not expected, that there will just be an amendment to add the funding for Glacier Valley Transit. So Ms. Kennedy and then Mr. Constant, and then we will adjourn. Ms. Kennedy?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just briefly wanted to say that I too might have an additional amendment, but it will probably be in the capital column. So with, potentially a bond. So anyway, just thought I'd bring that up, and hopefully I'll have something, if it all works out, on Tuesday. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Kennedy. Mr. Constant?
Yeah, thank you. I am concerned if the reconciliation rolls past January 1, what happens is some of those budget line items will suddenly be encumbered because the fiscal year is alive and running, and we won't be able to make changes, or we'll be told, you don't have the authority because that contract is, or that expenditure has been granted, or that's operating. And so I think it's important to keep it as possible before January 1 so that the budget isn't yet in effect.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. And on that note, it's 3:04, and I will go ahead and adjourn and see you all shortly at 3:30. Thank you all. We are adjourned.